good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Rachel Maddow, and what we are seeing unfold in the Pokrovsk region right now may go down as one of the darkest and most disastrous turning points of Russia's war strategy. It was meant to be a decisive push, a show of overwhelming force, a final demonstration that Russia's military might could bend the war to its will through sheer mass, fire, and unbreakable momentum. What it became instead was something far more haunting, far more irreversible, and far more revealing. A disaster so vast in scale and so brutal in reality that even those still inside it are struggling to comprehend what went wrong or if they will ever make it out alive. Russia believed it had engineered the ultimate breakthrough, one that would overwhelm Ukrainian defenses in the Pokrovsk axis, sever critical logistical arteries, and open a pathway deeper into the contested Donetsk region. Reports began circulating that Russian command had committed an enormous force, estimated around 170,000 troops, to the Pokrovsk theater. These forces were not merely token replacements or limited duration assault groups. They represented multiple operational level formations, mechanized brigades, airborne infantry, motorized rifle regiments, artillery detachments, drone warfare operators, medical battalions, and military engineers. The plan, we are told, was to crush the Ukrainian defense lines through relentless pressure, seize the pivotal transit hub, and then rapidly exploit the breach before Ukraine could recover its balance. The Kremlin wanted shock, awe, and inevitability. What it got was something very different. The initial phase seemed textbook. Artillery thundered, drones scattered across the sky, armored vehicles rolled forward, and infantry formations surged with rehearsed precision. Russian state media declared confidently that victory was not merely possible, it was inevitable. The talking heads on television used phrases like historic advance, irreversible momentum, and strategic turning point. Even pro-Kremlin military bloggers began posting celebratory rhetoric before the true battle ever reached its climax. For several days, the narrative machine painted Pokrovsk as Russia's next triumph. But wars are not won through televised optimism, and battlefields are not shaped by propaganda. Reality struck fast, cold, and merciless. The Ukrainian defenders in the Pokrovsk region were not disorganized, they were not demoralized, they were not unprepared, they did not panic under pressure. Instead, they executed a defense strategy that historians may later compare to some of the most devastating trap-based defenses of modern warfare. Ukrainian engineers, sappers, drone technicians, counter-battery teams, and reconnaissance units had spent months studying Russian doctrine, movement patterns, supply dependencies, and preferred assault corridors. And when Russia committed its massive force, Ukraine did not simply resist, they redirected the battlefield itself. Russian forces advanced too deep into terrain that appeared open but was in fact a layered labyrinth. Mined approaches, pre-sighted artillery zones, drone-controlled kill corridors, and bottlenecked logistics routes. What began as forward movement soon became a death march into a tightening funnel. Russian columns found themselves operating farther and farther from reliable supply depots. Fuel trucks were delayed, targeted, or destroyed. Ammunition convoys became priority targets, and medical extraction routes, crucial in large-scale offensives, were suddenly rendered unreliable, then unusable. Russian field commanders reported difficulties, but under the pressure of Kremlin expectations, they pressed forward anyway. Orders were repeated, even when feasibility evaporated. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces shifted tactics from conventional resistance to attritional isolation. Cut the arteries, not the limbs. When the arteries die, everything dies. By the end of the second week, Russian units began reporting severe shortages, vehicles abandoned due to lack of fuel, artillery batteries unable to sustain fire due to ammunition depletion, and infantry platoons rationing food and water fragments. Then the weather turned. Rain pounded the terrain, turning trenches into drowning pits and armored staging fields into steel cemeteries embedded in mud. Drones hovered like silent vultures above positions that could not relocate, could not advance, could not retreat. One Russian soldier, whose voice recording leaked through an anonymous messaging channel, whispered words that chilled even those who merely read them. They said, "We were advancing. We are not advancing. We are sinking." Another, in a message sent to his wife before communications went dark, wrote, "This is not an offensive. This is a burial. They are burying us while we are still alive. At this stage, Russian state media maintained the facade of progress, insisting that the operation was unfolding as planned and that reports of logistical strain were either exaggerated or fabricated by foreign outlets. But inside the encirclement zone near Pokrovsk, the truth was no longer political, it was biological. Men were starving, dehydrating, freezing, bleeding, and breaking down under psychological trauma that no official decree could censor. Satellite images and battlefield reconnaissance revealed something far more catastrophic than a stalled offensive. Tens of thousands of troops were no longer maneuvering. They were trapped, pinned inside shrinking pockets of survivability, surrounded not by infantry, but by absence. No shelter, no routes, no guarantees. Entire battalions reduced from fighting forces to static clusters of exhausted human beings waiting for supplies that would never arrive. This was not a battlefield pause. This was entombment. And from that moment forward, even Russia's most loyal analysts could no longer deny the implications. 170,000 troops had been thrown into a battlefield that no longer had functioning exits. A mass of men, larger than many entire national armies, was now locked inside a war zone that no commander could reliably navigate or extract. Not without consequences so politically devastating that even whispering them was considered taboo. Tonight, we are not talking about strategy. We are talking about survival. We are talking about the largest modern entrapment of Russian soldiers since the Second World War. We are talking about a nightmare unfolding in real time, a nightmare whose magnitude may still not be fully understood. The Kremlin could not publicly acknowledge what had happened, not at this scale, not without detonating its own illusion of strategic superiority. So instead of confronting the calamity, internal command shifted into a mode that military historians know well: preserve the narrative, even if it costs the army. Intelligence officers, political advisors, and top-level generals began crafting language that softened reality. Phrases like temporary operational fixation, rebalancing of territorial control, and managed tactical stabilization appeared in internal briefings. These are not words used when victory is near. These are words used when disaster must be hidden long enough for someone else to take the blame. Inside the encirclement, the emotional descent was faster than the physical breakdown. Russian units attempted to build makeshift dugouts, improvised latrines, and rainwater collection pits. Soldiers tore cloth from uniforms to wrap their feet. Helmets became water basins. Plastic bags became rain shields. Command drones that once directed fire missions were repurposed to search for edible vegetation between shell craters. Some groups reportedly boiled mud to separate water from sediment. Others melted boot soles over small fires to inhale the fumes, not to get high, but to dull hunger pangs. It's important to understand what truly breaks an army. It is not only artillery, it is not only airstrikes. What shatters an army is the realization that command cannot save them, that the machine they served no longer has an exit strategy that includes their survival. When that belief fractures, discipline collapses from the inside out. Any veteran will tell you, soldiers don't fight mainly for ideology. They fight because they believe someone is watching their back. In Pokrovsk, no one was watching. Radio communication, once constant and hierarchical, became primitive. Signals failed. Batteries died. Encryption keys expired. Units who once reported through formal chains began speaking like trapped civilians. Does anyone hear us? We need water. We have wounded. We cannot move. Is extraction coming? Silence became the battlefield's dominant sound, louder than artillery. One intercepted recording came from a Russian platoon commander whose calm tone made his words even more horrifying. He said, "We have not been abandoned. You cannot abandon what has already been written off." According to those familiar with military language, that sentence constitutes institutional surrender, even if not spoken officially. He no longer framed his men as assets. He framed them as inventory awaiting disposal. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces did not rush in to finish every pocket. Why would they? Logistically encircled troops consume their own strength faster than bullets ever could. Every trapped battalion became a self-depleting island of desperation. The longer they stayed, the more they deteriorated. The more they deteriorated, the less they could resist. War, at its coldest, rewards patience. As conditions worsened, internal fractures emerged. Some Russian soldiers attempted small-scale breakouts, sprinting through drone-watched fields under artillery shadow. Most of those attempts ended in dust. clouds, screams, and static. Others tried to tunnel out using entrenching tools and bare hands, digging shallow escape channels that collapsed under rain. A few groups reportedly approached Ukrainian positions with improvised white flags made from ripped undershirts. The Ukrainians, according to leaked accounts, warned them not to approach in groups larger than 3. Mass surrender could be mistaken for an attack. But the darkest outcome of all was psychological decomposition. A soldier without food becomes weak. A soldier without shelter becomes sick. A soldier without leadership becomes dangerous. But a soldier without meaning becomes something else entirely. Witness accounts suggest 3 psychological types emerged inside the encirclement. The resigned, who sat silently, staring into nothing men whose minds had already evacuated while their bodies remained. The frantic, who tried to convince themselves and others that rescue was minutes away, hours away, days away. It didn't matter as long as belief stayed breathing. And the feral men who began discarding hierarchy, codes, even humanity, driven only by survival instinct. You do not send 170,000 human beings into a sealed battlefield and expect order to remain unbroken. You expect madness. You expect fear. You expect regression. Yet, back in Moscow, officials still spoke of offensive continuity, as though continuity were a synonym for hope. State television broadcasts staged footage of armored vehicles rolling proudly through distant training fields, while the real armor near Pokrovsk sat broken, burned, or buried beneath the very earth it was meant to conquer. Searchlights failed. Night vision batteries died. Tourniquets dried. Dog tags were removed by some not as rebellion, but as resignation, because no man wants his identity documented if his final resting place is a mud pit behind an unmarked trench. One Russian corporal, through a smuggled message, reportedly wrote, "I used to fear the enemy. Now I fear the sunrise, because it means another day of being alive like this." Another wrote, "We are not fighting anymore. We are only not dead yet." At this point, Russian command had 3 theoretical options: airdrop supplies, break the encirclement, or order mass retreat. All 3 were riddled with catastrophic risk. Air support was heavily contested. Supply drops would be targeted. A breakout would mean moving exhausted men across open terrain without cover. And retreat was politically forbidden. Withdrawal means admission, and admission means collapse of narrative. And that is when something even more chilling happened. Reports began emerging that certain Russian commanders told their units to hold position until new orders, knowing full well that no new orders could change the terrain, the supply deficit, the weather, or the entrapment. Some units received directives phrased like scripture, not strategy, stand firm. Reinforcements are coming. But reinforcements were not coming. They could not come. And soon the soldiers knew it. This was not a pause. This was sacrifice by bureaucratic paralysis, the kind that does not kill swiftly, the kind that kills by waiting. And while all of this unfolded, the outside world began noticing something impossible to hide: the silence. Troop movement reports slowed. Logistics chatter thinned. Frosted satellite images revealed bodies not yet buried. Thermal signatures declined. What was once an army became a graveyard of heat slowly going cold. The Russian public, conditioned for years to accept selective truth, did not immediately realize what had happened. After all, casualty reports had always been classified, retreats always, repositioning, and silence always interpreted as confidence rather than collapse. But silence has weight, and over time that weight becomes unbearable. The families of deployed soldiers began to notice missed calls, unanswered messages, unread receipts. Social media status. Lights that once flickered green or yellow went black. Wives called military hotlines and heard scripted replies. Mothers wrote to regional enlistment offices and received form letters that read like apologies without admitting wrongdoing. The state did not yet confess, but its absences spoke louder than any speech. One woman, whose son had been mobilized 3 months before the Pokrovsk disaster, posted a message online. "I do not need medals or explanations. I need his voice." The post was deleted minutes later, but screenshots spread through private channels like sparks under dry brush. Even those who supported the war were shaken, because loyalty demands reciprocity. When a country asks for sacrifice, it must promise memory, safety, or meaning. But what if all three fail at once? Inside the encircled zone, decomposition took many forms. Supplies ran out entirely, the lucky units rationed crumbs, others resorted to tearing packaging from expired. Field kits to lick out the residue. Some boiled grass in metal helmets. Many became too weak to dig deeper trenches, forcing them to lie exposed under makeshift plastic sheets as drone surveillance passed overhead like silent angels of judgment. Commanders attempted to maintain order through ritual, morning roll calls, rotation assignments, and survival tasks. But roll calls became shorter every day. Absence no longer implied desertion, it implied permanence. And the psychological disintegration was far worse than the physical. The human mind is built to endure pain, but not the erasure of hope. A battle provides fear, adrenaline, clarity, even triumph. But entrapment provides nothing, no forward, no backward, no purpose. Men began to hallucinate sounds of approaching rescue columns. Some claimed they heard engines in the distance. Others insisted they saw lights approaching from the tree line. One soldier reportedly began saluting empty air at night, convinced that reinforcements had arrived and were inspecting their positions. When corrected, he became violent, screaming that anyone denying rescue was a traitor to morale. His screams continued long after others stopped arguing. Through drone surveillance, Ukrainian forces observed scenes rarely witnessed in modern warfare. Groups of Russian soldiers huddled silently, staring at their boots rather than scanning for targets. Rifles placed on the ground instead of being cradled. Men sleeping without helmets, not out of comfort, but resignation. Hours passed without movement, as though the battlefield had become a cemetery where the occupants were still technically alive. And yet, Russia could not admit disaster. Even internally, officers at rear headquarters began referring to the trapped forces not as soldiers, but as stabilized combat presences. That phrase, chilling in its vagueness, allowed bureaucracy to avoid responsibility while appearing professional. The men inside the pocket were no longer fighters. They were placeholders, symbols, bargaining chips. They were numbers on a ledger whose column title simply read, "Still counted." Meanwhile, Ukraine adjusted its strategy. They did not rush to annihilate every trapped unit, because each day of entrapment drained Russian resources in a way that missiles never could. Food, medicine, morale, and trust are currencies of war, and inside Pokrovsk, Russia was bankrupt in all four. Ukrainian psychological operations, normally subtle, became more direct. Loudspeakers broadcast messages into the fog. You are not being hunted. You are being forgotten. Another message reportedly said, your commanders are not coming for you. They are covering for you. At night, leaflets drifted down from drones, each one bearing a simple question. Who do you think cares more about your life, the enemy you face or the command that left you? Whether or not the leaflets were believed did not matter. The purpose was not to convert. The purpose was to crack the last intact internal narrative Russia's trapped soldiers still held, the belief that they mattered as individuals, not as numbers. The weather worsened, and with it, disease. Without clean water, wounds became infections, and infections became fevers. Without antibiotics, fevers became delirium. Medical officers fashioned splints from broken rifle stocks, pressure dressings from torn coats, and tourniquets from radio cords. But none of it mattered when there was no evacuation. The wounded became immobile, and the immobile became liabilities that the healthy could no longer carry. Some wounded begged for morphine. When morphine ran out, some begged for something else, anything else to end pain that no human should endure, fully conscious. The bodies began to accumulate. At first, they were respectfully placed near defensive berms. Then they were covered with tarps. Then, as space vanished and energy drained, they remained where they fell. Rats emerged. Insects followed. Men tried to cover their faces with cloths, not out of respect for the dead, but out of desperation to preserve the sanity of the living. But death has a smell that cloth cannot stop, and once it enters the lungs, it never leaves the memory. Back in Moscow, political strategists debated what narrative could possibly explain the silence surrounding Pokrovsk. They explored language that shifted focus from operational failure to heroic endurance. There were talks of manufacturing medal ceremonies for units that no longer existed, of constructing stories of valiant holding actions and strategic positional commitments. Propaganda is most effective when it replaces memory before memory solidifies. But how do you replace memory for men who may never return to recount it? Inside Russia, anger slowly blossomed, not on the streets, but in kitchens, basements, and private encrypted chats, the places where revolutions take their first breath. Words like waste, betrayal, and unanswered appeared more frequently. One message, allegedly from a reservist who had not yet been deployed, said, "If they send me to Pokrovsk, they will not be sending a soldier, they will be sending a witness." Nobody noticed at first, but that sentence marked a shift. When soldiers stop referring to themselves as fighters and start referring to themselves as witnesses, a regime no longer has warriors, it has archivists of its failure. Inside the pocket, the transformations continued. Men, once hardened by battlefield ferocity, now whispered to each other like prisoners avoiding detection. Some prayed for surrender, others prayed for death, and a small group prayed for neither. They prayed for meaning, which is the rarest resource in war. Meaning cannot be airdropped, trucked in, or radioed through static. Meaning requires someone powerful enough to say, "Your suffering mattered." No such voice arrived. And that is when the final, irreversible psychological break occurred. The trapped soldiers realized not that they might die, but that their death would serve no purpose. What happens to a human being when death no longer frightens them, but meaninglessness does? The battlefield historians will study the tactics and the logistics. The media will debate military decisions. Political figures will craft speeches that circle blame without ever landing on a subject. But psychologists will look at Pokrovsk and focus on one defining element, not the violence, but the void. Violence wounds the flesh. The void erases the purpose of that wound. In the deepening isolation, rumors became currency. Soldiers traded information the way starving men trade crumbs. Someone claimed that a new Russian armored column was massing just 20 kilometers away, preparing a breakthrough. Another swore they saw aircraft lights in the sky, signaling resupply. A third whispered that a secret peace deal was being negotiated, and that the trapped forces would be exchanged for international leverage. None of these rumors were verified, but hope does not require verification. Hope requires only a listener who wishes to believe. But hope, like food, can rot. When no rescue arrived, when days stretched into weeks, when the sound of distant artillery faded into storm winds, belief curdled into suspicion. If rescue was not coming, then why were they still being ordered to hold positions that no longer had strategic value? Why did radio operators periodically receive vague motivational messages, as if reading from pre-recorded scripts? Why did unit commanders stop mentioning timeframes altogether? The horrifying realization spread slowly, like frost creeping across glass. They had been written out of the war narrative long before they stopped fighting. Meanwhile, Ukrainian observers, watching through thermal lenses and drone feeds, noted that firefights diminished, not because ammunition was fully depleted, but because will had evaporated. Men still held rifles, but not for combat. They held them like mementos from a life that no longer belonged to them. Some placed their weapons on the ground with deliberation, as if setting down a burden rather than surrendering a tool. This was not mutiny. It was energetic extinction. Somewhere in a collapsed dugout, a wounded Russian officer reportedly told his surviving men, "Remove your magazines, clean your weapons. If we are found, let us not look like we have given up." His final concern was the impression carved into history, not the outcome of a lost cause. Soldiers obeyed, not because they believed it mattered militarily, but because rituals give shape to the shapeless. Across the pocket, batteries died, watches stopped, and the concept of time dissolved. Without schedules, soldiers could no longer distinguish day from night or yesterday from tomorrow. They spoke less, slept in fragmented cycles, and dreamed of ordinary things. Kitchens, bicycles, parks. Not victory. Not ideology, not nationalism, normalcy. The greatest casualty of modern war is not the body. It is the ordinary future that never arrives. Eventually, Ukrainian reconnaissance teams began hearing something unexpected, not gunshots, not artillery, but singing. Faint, ragged voices drifting through fog, singing old folk songs that predated the Russian state as it exists today. Songs learned from mothers and grandmothers, not drill sergeants. Songs that reminded them of a world where identity was not assigned by uniform, where loyalty was not demanded by decree, and where existence was not validated by sacrifice. Across military psychology, this phenomenon has a name: regression to foundational self. When all imposed identities collapse, soldier, patriot, combatant, unit member, the human mind returns to its earliest, simplest definition of itself. The contrast is striking. Geopolitical war on one side, lullaby echoes on the other. At the same time, internal Russian leadership circles began to fracture. Civilian officials demanded clarity, military commanders demanded reinforcements, financial authorities demanded justification for resource strain. Intelligence agencies demanded a narrative that could be weaponized. No one got what they wanted. Every proposed solution circled the same unspoken truth. Any rescue attempt of meaningful scale would require an even larger force to enter the same trap. Mathematically, the disaster was self-protecting. To save 170,000, one might need to risk another 80,000. No rational command would attempt it. No authoritarian command would admit it. Thus, the army in Pokrovsk became an irreversible equation, one whose solution was abandonment without proclamation. Inside the encirclement, soldiers began crafting their own explanations, each shaped by emotional necessity more than logic. Some believed they were sacrificial decoys for a grander offensive elsewhere. Others believed their commanders had been killed. Some claimed the chain of command had collapsed under internal coup attempts. A few clung to the belief that their suffering served a hidden purpose critical to Russia's future. Humans can survive without many things, but not without reason. Even false reason is preferable to none. Over time, voices quieted. The frantic early weeks gave way to monotone days in which sound seemed disrespectful to shared exhaustion. The strongest among them became caretakers of the weakest, not out of military duty, but out of the last ember of humanity that even war cannot extinguish. One soldier was reported to have given his last biscuit to a wounded stranger, not because he expected gratitude, but because he refused to die as a selfish man. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces faced moral questions rarely discussed in modern doctrine. Trapped enemies are still enemies, but trapped humans are still humans. And the world was watching not with cameras, but with conscience. Western observers, analyzing satellite heat signatures, noticed a grim transformation. The zone where 170,000 thermal signatures once pulsed like a living map began showing large, dark, heatless voids. Human life disappears not suddenly, but gradually, like embers fading beneath ash. And as those embers dimmed, somewhere in an office in Moscow, speechwriters prepared future statements filled with solemn phrases. Eternal honor, unbreakable duty, cost of security, sacrifice for the motherland. Words that would be spoken into microphones under polished lights by men whose shoes never touched battlefield mud. But the truth that history would record slowly, painfully, inevitably, is that these soldiers did not die for strategic territory or national security or ideological victory. They died because no one could admit a mistake in time to prevent mass entombment. They died not on the front lines, but in the space between pride and accountability. They died not in combat, but in neglect. And that is the deepest layer of tragedy. Not the suffering, but the preventability. Eventually, the silence surrounding Pokrovsk became the loudest story in the war, not because it was reported, but because it could no longer be hidden. Silence, when it grows large enough, becomes evidence. Ukrainian drones captured footage of abandoned trenches, burned out armored vehicles, medical tents collapsing under wind, and bodies lying in rows that no survivor remained strong enough to bury. Some images circulated online. Others were withheld out of respect for the dead or for the psychological safety of families who still prayed for calls that would never come. International intelligence agencies quietly confirmed what analysts already suspected. Pokrovsk was not a failed offensive. It was the single largest battlefield entrapment of the modern era. Larger than Debaltseve, larger than Ilovaisk, larger than most encirclements since the mid-20th century. Not because the enemy was overwhelmingly superior, but because strategic ambition exceeded logistical reality. A nation attempting to prove its invincibility had instead demonstrated the lethality of overreach. And while the battlefield grew colder, political temperature in Moscow rose sharply. Some factions blamed military leadership for reckless deployment. Others blamed intelligence for underestimating Ukrainian preparedness. A few blamed industry for undersupplying the military. But the quiet, most dangerous whispers blamed the presidency itself, because in systems built on centralized control, all failures ultimately collapse uphill. This did not mean revolt, nor rebellion, nor sudden collapse. Authoritarian systems do not shatter like glass. They crack like ice, silently at first, invisibly spreading, until one day the weight above them breaks through. Pokrovsk became one of those cracks. And whether it widens or freezes shut will depend not on guns, but on memory. Inside Russia, families began forming private support groups, sharing fragments of information collected from disappearing soldiers, intercepted whispers, and small details leaked by sympathetic medics or surviving escapees. Some mothers clung to unverified audio clips, replaying them nightly in dark apartments. Some wives refused to remove wedding bands, believing that to do so was to concede realities they were not yet prepared to face. Some fathers demanded answers, not out of fury, but out of duty. A man should know where his blood rests. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a brief statement weeks later, acknowledging heavy fighting, heroic resistance, and temporary communication disruptions. No numbers were given, no explanation offered, no accountability assigned. The word Pokrovsk appeared only once, as if minimizing its presence on paper could minimize its presence in history. But history does not respond to silence. It responds to evidence, memory, and testimony. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers who later cautiously entered certain abandoned pockets found scenes that would haunt them too. War is not a contest of whose trauma counts more. Sometimes both sides pay with unbearable memory. They discovered notes etched into trench walls, scratched with bayonets or broken nails. "We were here. Please remember us," they said. "We would be heroes. We just wanted to go home. If anyone finds this, tell my daughter I was trying. Forgive us." Near one overturned medical crate, someone had carved, "There are no enemies here anymore. Only ghosts." Ukrainian troops, hardened by years of brutal warfare, paused to absorb the magnitude. For a soldier accustomed to fighting, there is a difference between killing in combat and witnessing abandonment. One Ukrainian medic reportedly said, "We expected to fight soldiers, not shadows." Analysts predict that long after maps are redrawn, the psychological fallout will remain. Veterans who survived Pokrovsk, if any escaped successfully, may carry burdens that cannot be discharged through state medals or televised funerals. They will not only question the war, they will question the system that taught them loyalty was worth more than life itself. Political scientists warn that events like Pokrovsk do not always ignite immediate uprisings, but they sow the seeds of generational skepticism, especially among those who serve or who raise those who will. The next generation grows up not on the mythology of patriotic victory, but on the memory of institutional abandonment. And that memory is not easily erased by anthem or oath. Someday, perhaps years from now, when archives unseal and classified documents surface, the world may learn who made the final decision, who refused to issue the retreat order, who prioritized perception above survival. Those responsible may claim they acted in service of national honor, but honor cannot be built on the backs of men, no. One bothered to save. For now, what remains are three truths that no propaganda machine can fully dismantle. First, 170,000 men were sent into Pokrovsk with a promise that force could overcome reality. Second, reality proved stronger. Third, no one in power acknowledged it in time for those men to see home again. If you stand today on the outskirts of that battlefield, on the torn soil, beside the rusting metal, between the collapsed fortifications, you do not hear the sound of victory or defeat. You hear the wind, moving through equipment that no longer has owners, whispering through uniforms that will never again feel breath behind the cloth. You hear the quiet kind of afterlife that only war creates, memory without witnesses. And that is where the story leaves us. For now, not with a triumphant conclusion or a satisfying moral, but with a haunting question that every nation on earth, regardless of flag or ideology, must one day answer. What is the value of a soldier's life after the state no longer needs it? For Russia, for Ukraine, for the world, and for every future leader who believes control is the same as victory, Pokrovsk will remain a silent monument not to strength or bravery or conquest, but to the catastrophic cost of refusing to turn back when there was still time. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for joining me tonight. And wherever you are watching from, remember this. A nation's greatness is not measured by how many soldiers it can send to war, but by how many it refuses to leave behind.